Evenings in our house were a kind of routine I had grown to take for granted. Olivia curled up on the couch with her phone, the glow of the screen highlighting her delicate features, while I worked on my laptop. The faint hum of an old mystery show murmured from the TV, filling the gaps of silence between us. It was the sort of quiet that you assume means everything is okay, the type of peace that lulls you into complacency. That night started no differently, but it unraveled in a way I'll never forget. "Ethan, we need to talk," Olivia said suddenly, cutting through the background noise. Her tone stopped me mid-sentence on an email I was writing. I looked up, surprised. There was something about her voice, not hesitant or apologetic, but deliberate. Almost like she had practiced this moment. "Sure," I replied, closing the laptop and leaning back. I couldn't help but notice she wasn't looking at me, her fingers nervously tapping against the edge of her phone. "I've been seeing someone else," she said, and the air in the room seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating. "What?" The word escaped me in a whisper, more instinct than conscious thought. Her next words were deliberate and sharp, each one slicing away at my world. "It's Leo. Your brother." I blinked, sure I had misheard her. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, as if there was a way to rationalize something so incomprehensible. "You're joking." My voice cracked, barely louder than a murmur. But Olivia didn't laugh. She just stared at me, her eyes fixed on mine, waiting for the reality to sink in. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice steady, her face unreadable. Then the final blow, and it's his. The room spun, my chest tightening as if someone had driven a fist straight through me. Before I could process what I'd just heard, Leo strolled into the room like he owned the place. He had that same cocky grin he'd always had when he beat me at something. Except this wasn't a game. "Hey, big bro," he said, his tone smug, almost victorious. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Olivia continued as though she hadn't just detonated my entire world. "We're moving to Paris," she said matter-of-factly, like she was sharing vacation plans. "Your parents are helping us. They're thrilled about the baby." The betrayal expanded in an instant. It wasn't just Olivia and Leo, it was my entire family. The people I had trusted most in the world had orchestrated this, a coup in my own home. I looked at her, then at Leo, searching for some flicker of regret or humanity. There was none. Olivia sat there, composed, while Leo smirked like this was all some big joke. For a moment, I thought about yelling, screaming, demanding answers. But I didn't. Instead, I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and walked past them. My mind buzzed with adrenaline as I stepped outside into the cool night air. I needed space. I needed to breathe. Above me, the stars twinkled like they always did, indifferent to the chaos unraveling below. My hands were trembling, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. I thought about the years I'd spent building a life with Olivia, about the trust I'd placed in my family, the love I'd poured into them. It wasn't just betrayal, it was annihilation. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, something inside me began to shift. The initial wave of pain and disbelief gave way to something colder, sharper. A sense of clarity. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a declaration of war. The night air bit at my skin as I stood on the porch, gripping the wooden railing so hard my knuckles turned white. Inside, I could still hear faint murmurs of conversation, Olivia's voice calm and composed, Leo's smug laugh echoing in the back of my mind. I didn't go back in. Not yet. I needed a plan. In that moment, I wasn't even sure what I was feeling. Anger, definitely. A raw, burning fury that pulsed in my chest. But beneath that was something quieter and far more dangerous. Resolve. I wasn't the type to throw punches or slam doors. I wasn't going to yell or cry or beg for answers. That wasn't me. Instead, I took a breath, each inhale steadying me just enough to think clearly. When I finally walked back into the house, the atmosphere felt different. They were still in the living room, speaking in hushed tones. Olivia's head snapped toward me, her face briefly betraying a flicker of nervousness before she masked it with indifference. "You okay?" she asked, as though she hadn't just detonated a bomb in my life. "Yeah," I said simply, my voice steady and calm. That seemed to unnerve her more than if I'd started shouting. Leo leaned back on the couch, arms sprawled out like he didn't have a care in the world. "You're taking this better than I thought," he said with a chuckle. I didn't respond. I just looked at him, really looked at him. My younger brother, the golden boy of the family. He'd always been good at charming people, especially my parents. Growing up, he was the one who got the praise while I quietly handled responsibilities. But now, all I could see was a man who had no problem destroying everything I cared about. "You should get some rest, Ethan," Olivia said, her tone soft, almost condescending. "This is a lot to process." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, you're right. I'll need some time to think things through." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she'd expected me to explode and was relieved that I hadn't. But the truth was, my lack of reaction wasn't a sign of acceptance, it was strategy. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep wasn't an option. My mind raced with a million thoughts, piecing together fragments of conversations, memories, and plans. I thought about Olivia and Leo, their betrayal cutting deeper than I could have imagined. I thought about my parents, their complicity making it all the worse. And then I thought about what I was going to do next. By morning, I had a framework in my mind. Nothing fully fleshed out yet, but the beginning of a plan. I got up early, my movements deliberate as I showered, dressed, and prepared for the day like it was any other. Olivia was still asleep when I left the house, her phone clutched in her hand like some kind of lifeline. I didn't say goodbye. Instead, I went straight to a cafe across town, a quiet place I'd visited often enough to feel comfortable but rarely enough that I wouldn't be noticed. I ordered a coffee, pulled out my laptop, and got to work. The first step was information. If Olivia and Leo thought they could blindside me, they were wrong. I started with her phone. I'd seen her enter her passcode enough times. My birthday of all things. It was almost insulting how easy it was. By the time I finished, I had enough to start weaving the threads. There were texts, photos, bank statements. She'd been siphoning money from our joint account to support Leo for months. Plane tickets to Paris, hotel reservations, even conversations with my parents about their plans to move closer to them once the baby was born. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated. I logged out, leaving no trace of my intrusion. As I closed the laptop, I leaned back in my seat and allowed myself a small, bitter smile. This wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy. But if they thought I was going to roll over and let them win, they didn't know me at all. The storm was coming. They just didn't realize it yet. The day unfolded slowly, each hour a balancing act between playing the part of the clueless husband and meticulously setting up the first steps of my plan. I returned home in the afternoon to find Olivia on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her legs tucked under her like nothing had changed. She looked up briefly when I walked in, her expression unreadable. "You were out early," she remarked, her tone light, casual. "Just needed to clear my head," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. I glanced at her briefly before heading to the kitchen. I could feel her eyes on me, likely searching for any sign of anger or resentment. She wouldn't find any. Not yet. By the time Leo sauntered in later that day, I was prepared. I had spent hours going through every interaction Olivia and Leo had shared, building a picture of just how deep their betrayal went. The money transfers were one thing, but the sheer audacity of their messages, laughing about how easy it was to deceive me, stung the most. Leo dropped into the armchair like he belonged there, flipping through his phone without a care in the world. "How's the day treating you, bro?" he asked, his voice tinged with that same smugness he always carried. "Fine," I said simply, forcing a smile. "You two have any big plans for Paris yet?" Olivia's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We're still figuring it out," she said cautiously. Leo grinned, clearly reveling in the moment. "Got some ideas. Might check out a place near Montmartre. Real artsy, you know?" I nodded, pretending to be interested. "Sounds nice. You're really going all out, huh?" Olivia shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting me to engage with them like this. She probably thought I'd be too devastated to talk, let alone ask questions. I let the conversation drift after that, keeping it light, nonchalant. I wasn't ready to tip my hand just yet. Later that evening, as they settled into their usual routine of whispering to each other and laughing like a couple of teenagers, I locked myself in my office. The walls of the small room were lined with bookshelves, but it was the desk where my real work began. The first step was confirming everything I'd uncovered earlier. Olivia's phone had provided a treasure trove of information, but I needed more. I logged into our bank account again, cross-referencing transfers and withdrawals. It didn't take long to piece together where the money had gone. Leo's mounting debts, some luxury purchases, and even a down payment for a rental in Paris. Satisfied, I turned my attention to my parents. It still stung, knowing they had sided with Leo in this. But it also made them part of the equation. I started pulling up property records, trust fund details, and financial statements. My dad wasn't the most tech-savvy, and it didn't take much effort to log into their accounts. What I found was exactly what I needed. Evidence of funds being funneled to support Leo's lifestyle, all while leaving them more exposed than they realized. It was becoming clear to me that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about dismantling every ounce of security they had taken for granted. They had stolen from me, my wife, my trust, my family. Now it was time to take back everything they had built on that betrayal. By the time I closed my laptop, it was past midnight. The house was quiet, save for the faint creak of floorboards as Olivia moved upstairs. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screensaver on my computer as my thoughts swirled. This wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy. But I had time. For now, I played the role of the calm, oblivious husband. But beneath the surface, every move was calculated. Every step brought me closer to unraveling the illusion they had so carefully crafted. And when it all came crashing down, I would make sure they understood the depth of what they had done. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about making sure they never forgot who they had betrayed. The days that followed were a test of my patience, each one a careful balancing act. I kept my demeanor steady, my routine unchanged. On the surface, I was the picture of a man adjusting to heartbreak. Calm, introspective, even cooperative. But beneath that exterior, every moment was dedicated to pulling apart the life they had so carelessly built atop mine. Olivia must have felt some relief at my apparent acceptance. She moved around the house with an ease that hadn't been there in days, probably thinking the worst had passed. She even started packing small boxes in the evenings, filling them with her clothes, photos, and trinkets. The sight of it turned my stomach, but I didn't let it show. I asked her once, casually, "So, when's the big move happening?" Her hands froze over a stack of sweaters before she turned to me. "A few weeks, maybe a month," she said, testing my reaction. I nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Sounds like a big change." She blinked, caught off guard by my nonchalant response. "Yeah, I guess it is." But I wasn't asking for small talk. I needed to know their timeline. Every piece of information was another thread in the web I was weaving. Meanwhile, Leo continued his brazen presence in my house, treating it more like a pit stop than a place he had shattered. He had started bringing over boxes too, casually stacking them in the garage like he already owned the place. It was during one of these visits that I struck the first real blow. "Leo," I said as I found him in the garage, sorting through some junk he had claimed from my tool shed. "Yeah." He didn't even look up, too focused on rummaging through my belongings. I leaned casually against the doorway, holding my phone. "Quick question. Have you talked to your landlord recently?" That got his attention. He turned, furrowing his brow. "What? Why?" I shrugged, holding up my phone and scrolling through a fake article I had mocked up. "There's been a string of evictions in your area. Something about property damage and unpaid rent. Thought you might want to check on that." The color drained from his face for just a moment before he masked it with a forced chuckle. "Nah, I'm good. All settled up over there." "Good to know," I said, pushing off the doorway. "Wouldn't want anything messing up your plans, you know?" I left him there, but not before catching the flicker of doubt in his expression. He didn't know it yet, but I had already contacted his landlord, anonymously tipping them off about the unpaid rent and issues with noise complaints. A formal eviction notice would be arriving soon. Back inside, I turned my attention to Olivia's finances. I'd frozen the joint account a day earlier, rerouting the remaining funds into a private one in my name. I knew it wouldn't take long for her to notice. Sure enough, the next morning, she stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with frustration. "Ethan, did you mess with the bank account?" she demanded, holding up her phone like it was evidence in a trial. I played dumb, setting down my mug. What do you mean? Our account is frozen, she snapped. I can't access anything. I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. Really? Must be some kind of error. You should call the bank. Her eyes narrowed, searching my face for any sign of deception. But I had perfected this act. After a long pause, she sighed and turned away, muttering under her breath as she stomped off to make the call. As much as it satisfied me to see her frustration, this was only the beginning. The next step was more personal. I had reached out to a private investigator earlier that week, a meticulous professional with a knack for uncovering secrets. The report I received was damning. Leo's mountain of unpaid debts, shady business dealings, and a trail of casual affairs that painted a very different picture of him than the one he showed to Olivia. I compiled everything into a neat little folder, ready to use when the time was right. By the end of the week, the cracks were starting to show. Leo's bravado wavered. Olivia grew more irritable, snapping at small things. They still didn't suspect me, at least not entirely, but the strain was becoming evident. And that was the point. I wasn't aiming for a single devastating blow. I wanted their world to crumble piece by piece, just like they had done to mine. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. And I was only getting started. By the time the weekend rolled around, the cracks in their facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Olivia, who once carried herself with the composed elegance of someone always in control, now moved through the house like a tightly wound spring. She snapped at minor inconveniences, her frustration bubbling to the surface in sharp, clipped responses. Leo, on the other hand, tried to maintain his usual cocky demeanor, but I could see the cracks there too, the way his confidence faltered when he thought no one was watching. It was all unraveling, and I hadn't even delivered the biggest blows yet. Saturday morning, Olivia and Leo sat in the kitchen, quietly discussing their plans. I walked in casually, pouring myself a cup of coffee and sitting down across from them. Busy day ahead? I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational. Olivia glanced at Leo before responding. Just sorting through some things. We've got a lot to prepare. For Paris? I asked, letting the word hang in the air. Leo smirked, though it looked forced. That's right. You know, big plans, big changes. You could learn a thing or two about taking risks, Ethan. I sipped my coffee, meeting his gaze with a calm, unbothered expression. I'll keep that in mind. They didn't know it yet, but their big plans were already on shaky ground. By the time they left the house later that day, I was ready to escalate things. First, I reached out to the bank, using the evidence I had gathered to file a formal fraud report against Olivia for her unauthorized transfers. The process would take time, but it was a critical step in cutting off her financial support. Next, I sent an anonymous tip to the creditors pursuing Leo, attaching key details about his recent activities and financial mismanagement. I made sure the information was precise enough to raise alarms without revealing my involvement. Then, it was time to address my parents. It wasn't easy, confronting the people who had raised me, who I had once believed would always have my back. But their betrayal cut deeper than Olivia's or Leo's. They had chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. I called them, my voice steady but firm. We need to talk. My father answered first, his voice cautious. Ethan, is this about what Olivia told us? I let out a bitter laugh. You mean the part where she's leaving me for Leo, and you're supporting them? Yeah, Dad, it's about that. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. Look, son, this isn't easy for any of us. We didn't want to hurt you, but you did anyway, I interrupted, my tone sharp. You're helping them move to Paris, funding their entire new life while I'm left to pick up the pieces. Do you have any idea what that feels like? My mother chimed in, her voice softer but no less infuriating. We just want what's best for everyone, Ethan. We thought. You thought wrong, I snapped. This isn't about what's best for everyone. This is about you choosing favorites, like you always have. Well, guess what? You've made your choice, and now you can deal with the consequences. Before they could respond, I hung up. It wasn't satisfying, not yet, but it was necessary. They needed to know that their actions had consequences. By the time Olivia and Leo returned home that evening, they were met with the first signs of the chaos I had sown. Leo's phone buzzed constantly, his landlord's eviction notice arriving alongside a string of messages from creditors demanding payment. Olivia's attempts to access the bank account were met with error messages and notifications of fraud investigations. The tension was palpable as they whispered angrily in the living room, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch snippets of their frustration. "Can't believe this is happening all at once. You said you had it under control. We'll figure it out, just calm down." I stayed out of sight, listening from the kitchen as a small, satisfied smile tugged at my lips. They were starting to feel it now, the weight of their choices closing in around them. As I headed upstairs to my room, I paused at the top of the staircase, glancing back toward the living room. They had no idea that this was just the beginning. By the time I was done, they wouldn't just feel the consequences, they would live them. Every day, every moment, a reminder of the trust they had shattered and the life they had tried to destroy. The seeds of chaos had been planted. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to bloom. By Monday morning, the cracks in their world were splitting wide open. Olivia's once meticulously curated calm had dissolved into frantic energy. She paced the living room in her robe, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her conversation with the bank sounded like a tug of war, her frustration bleeding into the clipped edges of her voice. "I don't understand," she snapped, turning sharply. "This is clearly a mistake. There's no way my account should be frozen." I listened from the kitchen, the rhythmic tap of my coffee spoon against the mug drowning out the sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood. Across the room, Leo sat slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a scowl etched onto his face. The eviction notice I had orchestrated was crumpled on the coffee table in front of him, a glaring reminder that things were spiraling out of his control. "Can't believe this," he muttered, tossing his phone down. "I've got 3 days to move out." 3 days. Olivia hung up the call with an exasperated sigh, throwing her phone onto the couch next to him. "It's just a bump in the road," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "We'll figure it out." I lingered in the doorway, sipping my coffee and watching them unravel. They still had no idea that every problem they faced had my fingerprints all over it. "Everything okay?" I asked, stepping into the room with a casual smile. Leo shot me a glare, but Olivia forced a tight smile. "Just a little financial hiccup," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Hiccups happen," I replied with a shrug. "Let me know if you need any help." They didn't respond, and I didn't expect them to. But the tension in the room was undeniable. Later that afternoon, I took things a step further. The private investigator I had hired had uncovered even more dirt on Leo, outstanding debts from failed ventures, unpaid credit card bills, and even proof of a fraudulent business he had started and abandoned. Armed with this information, I sent a series of anonymous tips to his creditors and the authorities, ensuring that every thread of his financial instability would come crashing down on him at once. By the time evening rolled around, I could tell the weight of it all was beginning to suffocate them. Leo spent most of the day on the phone, his voice alternating between anger and desperation as he tried to fend off calls from collection agencies and landlords. Olivia's frustration simmered just below the surface, her sharp replies to him betraying her own growing anxiety. But the real collapse came at dinner. Olivia insisted on preparing a meal, her attempt to restore some sense of normalcy to their crumbling situation. She plated the food with the same care she used to when things were better, when we were better. But the tension at the table was impossible to ignore. Leo shoved his fork into his plate with more force than necessary, his jaw tight. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Not at the table, Leo," Olivia snapped, her voice strained. "Not at the table," he shot back, his voice rising. "You've got your bank account frozen, I'm getting kicked out of my place, and you're worried about table manners?" Her cheeks flushed as she slammed her fork down, the sound ringing out in the silence. "Do you think I'm not stressed? Do you think I wanted any of this?" I leaned back in my chair, watching the argument unfold like a spectator at a play. "Yeah, well, maybe you should have thought this through before dragging me into your mess," Leo barked. "My mess?" Olivia's voice cracked, her composure unraveling completely. "You're the one who insisted we go through with this." They continued to bicker, their words growing louder, harsher. Every accusation, every jab chipped away at the foundation they thought they had. I finished my meal in silence, wiping my mouth with a napkin before standing up. "Thanks for dinner," I said, my tone even. "It was delicious." Neither of them responded, too caught up in their fight to notice as I walked away. In the solitude of my room, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. This was exactly what I wanted, to watch them turn on each other, their alliance crumbling under the weight of their choices. They had betrayed me, torn apart my life without a second thought. Now they were finally beginning to understand what that felt like. And the best part? The collapse was far from over. By Tuesday, the unraveling had reached new heights. Their alliance, once smug and united, was barely holding together, and I could feel the tension hanging heavy in the air. Leo's frustration boiled over more often, his voice echoing through the house as he stomped from room to room. Olivia, usually poised, was beginning to crack under the weight of their collapsing plans. I spent most of the morning out, letting them stew in their chaos while I worked on the next phase of my plan. The private investigator's report on Leo wasn't just a weapon for financial ruin. It was a grenade I planned to toss into their fragile social circles. I started by crafting an anonymous email, attaching damning evidence of Leo's unpaid debts, fraudulent business ventures, and even a string of questionable relationships that Olivia likely didn't know about. I made sure to send it to the right people, his former employers, a few of Olivia's friends, and even a couple of family acquaintances who were prone to gossip. The email was vague enough to mask my involvement but specific enough to make waves. When I returned home in the early afternoon, I found Olivia sitting on the couch, her phone in her lap, her face pale. She looked up when I walked in, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Have you been online today?" she asked abruptly, her voice tense. I feigned confusion, setting my keys down on the counter. "No, why?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for a crack in my composure. "Leo's name is all over the place. People are sharing things about him. Debts, fraud accusations." "Really?" I replied, keeping my voice even. "That's unfortunate." She didn't respond, her gaze flickering back to her phone as she began furiously typing. Leo burst through the door moments later, slamming it shut behind him. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his face flushed with anger. Olivia stood, holding out her phone. "People are talking, Leo, about you. There are emails, posts, everything." "Yeah, I know," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. "I've been getting calls all morning." The two of them started arguing, their voices overlapping as accusations flew. I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching silently. This was exactly what I wanted, to let them destroy each other while I stayed in the background, invisible. When Leo stormed off upstairs, slamming the door behind him, Olivia sank back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I considered walking away, letting her stew in her own guilt, but something compelled me to stay. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She looked up, her eyes rimmed red. "No, Ethan, I'm not okay. Everything's falling apart. I feel like I'm drowning." I didn't offer comfort. Instead, I simply nodded. "Sometimes, life catches up with you." Her brows furrowed at my words, but she didn't reply. Later that evening, as they both retreated to their respective corners of the house, I prepared for the next move. It was time to address the one thing Olivia and Leo still had, a shred of credibility in our social circle. I opened another email account, anonymous as always, and began composing a new message. This one included screenshots of their texts, smug and cruel exchanges mocking me, planning their future at my expense. I sent it to a carefully selected group of friends and colleagues, people I knew wouldn't hesitate to share it with others. By the next morning, the fallout was immediate. Messages began pouring in, apologies, shock, outrage. My phone buzzed constantly with friends asking if the rumors were true. I played my part well, responding with carefully crafted words of betrayal and heartbreak. Leo and Olivia were completely blindsided. I watched from the sidelines as they scrambled to control the narrative, their frantic attempts to salvage their reputations only making things worse. By mid-afternoon, Olivia confronted me in the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. "Did you have something to do with this?" she demanded, holding up her phone. "With what?" I asked calmly, sipping my coffee. "All of this," she snapped. "The emails, the texts, everyone is talking about us, Ethan." I set my mug down, meeting her gaze. "I'm not the one who betrayed everyone's trust, Olivia. That was you." Her expression faltered, the fight in her eyes dimming slightly. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, unable to find the words. As she walked away, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The fuse had been lit. Now, all I had to do was watch it burn. By Thursday morning, the storm I had been building was in full swing. The whispers in our social circle had turned into full-blown outrage. Messages flooded my phone, some sympathetic, others outright furious at Leo and Olivia. Every email I had sent, every piece of carefully planted evidence, was working as intended. Leo stayed locked in the guest room most of the day, emerging only for coffee and the occasional heated phone call. Olivia, on the other hand, had shifted into damage control mode, desperately trying to salvage her image. I caught her pacing the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. "Rebecca, I don't know what you've heard, but it's not true," she said, her voice wavering. "There's been a misunderstanding. Ethan's just upset." She glanced at me as I entered the room, her eyes narrowing slightly before she turned away. I took my time pouring a glass of water, pretending not to notice her discomfort. "Let me call you back," she muttered, ending the call and tossing her phone onto the couch. "You're up early," I said, keeping my tone light. "I couldn't sleep," she snapped, running a hand through her hair. "This mess is ruining everything." I leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. It's strange how quickly things can fall apart when you don't have the truth on your side. She flinched at my words, her gaze hardening. "Don't act like you're innocent in all this, Ethan. I know you've been meddling." "Meddling?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean like moving to Paris with my brother and my parents' money? That kind of meddling?" Her face flushed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her phone and stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next step in my plan was already in motion. Using the financial documents I had uncovered, I reached out to the family lawyer, ensuring that Olivia would face significant obstacles in accessing any shared assets. The lawyer was thorough, freezing accounts and filing motions that would tie up her resources for months, if not longer. By the time Leo came downstairs, his usual swagger was replaced with a tense, defensive energy. He glanced at me briefly before heading to the fridge, pulling out a beer despite the early hour. "Rough day?" I asked casually, taking a seat at the kitchen table. He snorted, twisting off the cap. "You could say that." I tilted my head, feigning concern. "Anything I can help with?" His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "You think this is funny, don't you?" "Not at all," I replied smoothly. "I think it's tragic, actually. Watching someone lose everything because of their own choices? That's not funny. That's sad." He slammed the bottle down on the counter, his expression darkening. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just sit there and judge me?" I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "I don't need to judge you, Leo. You've done that all by yourself." For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. But then he backed down, muttering under his breath as he left the room. That evening, I decided to make my next move. Olivia and Leo had planned to attend a small gathering with mutual friends, an attempt to mend their social standing, no doubt. I wasn't invited, of course, but that didn't mean I couldn't be there in spirit. I sent one final email, this time to the host of the gathering, attaching every piece of incriminating evidence I had on Olivia and Leo. The texts, the bank records, the fraudulent dealings, it was all there, wrapped in a neat little package that couldn't be ignored. When Olivia and Leo returned home later that night, their faces were pale, their movements hurried. They didn't speak to me as they passed through the kitchen, but I could feel the tension radiating off them. I learned the details the next morning from a friend who had been at the gathering. The host had confronted Olivia and Leo in front of everyone, demanding answers about the texts and accusations. It wasn't long before the room turned against them, their explanations falling flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The walls were closing in on them, and they knew it. For the first time, I saw real fear in their eyes. They were losing control of the narrative, their carefully constructed lies crumbling under the weight of the truth. And I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. By Friday, the cracks in their facade had widened into chasms. The fallout from the gathering the night before had reached every corner of our social circle, and the news was spreading like wildfire. Friends and acquaintances who had once fawned over Olivia and Leo were now turning their backs on them, their betrayal too shocking, too vile to ignore. The house, once filled with their smug laughter, now felt cold and heavy. Leo barely left the guest room, his phone silenced after what must have been an onslaught of calls and messages. Olivia, usually so composed, spent most of the day pacing, muttering under her breath as she tried to figure out how to salvage what little she had left. I bided my time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the next blow. That afternoon, Olivia approached me in the kitchen, her expression a mix of frustration and desperation. "Ethan," she began, her voice strained, "we need to talk." I set down my coffee and leaned against the counter, folding my arms. "What about?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure we were alone. "Look, I know you're angry. I get it. But we need to find a way to move past this." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused. "Move past this? You've burned every bridge, Olivia. There's no moving past what you've done." Her jaw tightened, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're not innocent in this, Ethan. You've been—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Whatever blame-shifting you're about to try, just stop. You betrayed me, Olivia. You tore apart this family for him." I gestured toward the stairs where Leo was likely sulking. "You don't get to lecture me about moving past anything." For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but no words came out. She turned and walked away, leaving me with a sense of grim satisfaction. Later that evening, I set my plan into motion. The private investigator had unearthed a treasure trove of Leo's indiscretions, flings, broken promises, and debts owed to people he should have never crossed. Among them was a scorned ex-girlfriend with no love lost for Leo, someone who had the receipts to back up her claims. I reached out to her anonymously, presenting the situation in a way that aligned our interests. Within hours, she had posted a detailed account of her experience with Leo on social media, tagging several mutual acquaintances and attaching screenshots of his lies. The post went viral in our community within minutes. By the time Leo emerged from his room, phone in hand, he looked like a man teetering on the edge of a breakdown. "This is your fault," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me as he stormed into the living room. I didn't flinch, meeting his glare with calm indifference. "My fault? That's interesting, considering everything that's happening is because of you." He clenched his fists, his voice rising. "You've been sabotaging me from the start. The bank, the texts, the—" "Stop pretending you're the victim," I said sharply, cutting him off. "You made your choices, Leo. You and Olivia both. Now you're just dealing with the consequences." Olivia appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo rounded on her, his anger spilling over. "This is all because of you. You dragged me into this mess, and now it's blowing up in our faces." Her shock quickly turned to fury. "Me? You're the one who couldn't keep your life together. If you hadn't—" "Enough," I said, my voice steady but firm. They both turned to me, their arguments dying on their lips. "This isn't about who dragged who into what," I continued, stepping forward. "This is about the fact that you both betrayed me, and now, finally, you're paying for it." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, they looked genuinely defeated, their bravado and arrogance stripped away. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice calm but unwavering. Leo opened his mouth to argue, but Olivia placed a hand on his arm, shaking her head. She knew they had lost. Without another word, they turned and walked upstairs, likely to gather their things. I stayed in the living room, listening to the sound of drawers opening and closing, the muted thud of suitcases being packed. When they finally left, the house felt different. Quieter. Lighter. I stood in the doorway, watching them drive away, my heart heavy but resolute. This was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, of purpose. They had broken me, but I had rebuilt myself stronger. And now, I would ensure that the wreckage of their actions stayed with them, a constant reminder of the life they had tried to destroy. The silence that followed their departure was almost surreal. For weeks, the house had been a battlefield, every corner steeped in tension and deceit. Now, it was just me and the stillness, a quiet that felt both heavy and liberating. I stood by the window for a while, watching their car disappear down the street. My emotions were a tangled mess, anger, sadness, relief. But above all, there was clarity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a man who had survived the wreckage. That evening, I walked through the house, taking in the spaces they had occupied. The living room, where they had whispered their plans and laughed at my expense. The kitchen, where Olivia's hollow attempts at normalcy had played out. The guest room, where Leo had hidden from the chaos he'd created. I opened the windows, letting in the crisp night air, as if to cleanse the house of their presence. It was time to rebuild. The next morning, I called the lawyer, finalizing the paperwork to sell the house. It wasn't just a practical decision, it was symbolic. This house had been the foundation of my life with Olivia, and now it was a reminder of her betrayal. Letting it go was the first step toward something new. I also reached out to a therapist, knowing I needed to work through the emotional toll of everything that had happened. This wasn't just about Olivia and Leo, it was about years of trust and identity shattered by the people closest to me. In the weeks that followed, I began to rediscover myself. I spent more time on the hobbies I had abandoned over the years. Photography, hiking, even picking up a guitar I hadn't touched since college. Each small step felt like reclaiming a part of me that had been lost. Eventually, I met Claire. It wasn't some whirlwind romance or a dramatic rebound. It was quiet, steady, a connection that grew over time. She was kind and patient, with a sharp wit that caught me off guard in the best way. We met at a local community event, where I had volunteered to photograph the event for their website. She was there with a group of friends, laughing at some joke I didn't hear. Her energy was magnetic, drawing people in without effort. At first, I was hesitant, unsure if I was ready to let someone new into my life. But Claire didn't push. She simply showed up, at the cafe where I liked to write, at the park where I went for walks. Little by little, she became part of my world, reminding me what it felt like to trust someone. With her help, I started to see the betrayal for what it was. A chapter, not the entire story. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my new place, a modest house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, Claire reached for my hand. "You've been through a lot," she said softly. "But you've come out the other side stronger." I looked at her, the warmth of her presence easing the ache that had lingered for so long. "I didn't do it alone," I admitted. "The journey wasn't perfect, and there were still days when the memories clawed at me. But they didn't define me anymore. I had scorched the earth behind me, leaving no room for those who had betrayed me to return. But in doing so, I had cleared a path for something new." As the sun set that evening, casting a warm glow over the horizon, I realized I had finally found peace. Not in forgetting the past, but in choosing to move forward. This was my life now, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was truly mine.